Hello and welcome. Thank you very much for joining me today for today's presentation as part of the GreyLearning webinar series. The subject today, which lenses do you bring? Whether that's a short trip, a long trip, just a trip out to the backyard to photograph your flowers, what sort of lenses should you be thinking about for any trip, essentially? And I know that many of you, of course, are already familiar with me, but just as a reminder, I'm Tim Gray, and I'm happy to be here. I'm always excited, always have a fun time presenting these webinars, and appreciate the great feedback that we get whenever we present the webinar. So thank you very much, those of you who have shared how much you enjoy them. This, by the way, is a photo of me atop Dune 7 near Walvis Bay in Namibia. And, part of the theme, as you've probably picked up if you've been following me for any period of time, is that for me, photography largely means travel. I travel extensively. Most of my photography involves traveling somewhere else. And so, I don't know if you've ever climbed up to the top of a sand dune, but obviously, as this photo reveals, I have. And climbing up to the top of a sand dune, it's not very easy. That sand keeps shifting. You might be able to tell I've got a camera backpack on my shoulder there. And so along the way, you can bet I was thinking, how many lenses do I really want to be carrying when I'm climbing to the top of the highest sand dune in Namibia? And those are the sorts of decisions that I'm going to be talking about today in the context of making decisions about which lenses do you actually bring along with you. And some of that sort of extends beyond just what are you taking on the trip, and thinking about what am I taking today? If it's a multiple day trip, what am I going to take with me when I'm venturing out on foot today? So keep in mind that there's kind of a variety of different scales, you might say, about these different decisions. But before we dive into talking about that, I do want to give another shout out to Tamron and thank them very much for making the GreyLearning webinar series possible through their sponsorship. And as a reminder, if you haven't checked it out already, I had great fun being the star of the show, as it were, being featured in a video of me photographing out in the remarkable Palouse region of eastern Washington state. If you haven't taken a look at that, or if you'd just like to check it out again, you can see it on the Tamron YouTube channel at youtube.com/TamronVids. So be sure to check that out. And I do want to hasten to add that yes, Tamron makes and sells lenses, and they sponsor this webinar, but I can assure you today's presentation is not a sales pitch for Tamron. Yes, I happen to use some Tamron lenses, but this isn't about you buying Tamron lenses. This really is about making decisions about which lenses you bring on a given photo trip or outing. And also, I think it's important to keep in mind right from the start that the same basic decisions need to be made. As I mentioned before, whether you're just going out into the backyard to photograph flowers or you're traveling halfway around the world, you've still got to make decisions about what lens you're going to grab or what lens is going to be in your bag at any given time. And I should also point out that I do shoot primarily digital SLR, and so that's sort of my frame of reference. As it turns out, my primary digital SLR has a cropped sensor, meaning there's that sort of cropping of the image circle, the field of view narrower, you might say. It gives us the effect of a longer focal length lens by virtue of cropping that image circle, meaning in terms of the actual field of view of the photo. But the reason I mention that is just to keep in mind, when I'm talking about focal lengths, I'm talking from that perspective. And so if, for example, you're shooting mirrorless, then you might have to do a little bit of translation in terms of what the meaning is of those various focal lengths, or if you're shooting medium format. So the basic concepts that I'm going to talk about would apply to virtually any camera. I suppose even smartphone photography. If you're using an iPhone with some accessory lenses, you need to decide which of those lenses you're going to bring. In that case, it's a much easier decision because the lenses would generally fit right in your pocket, but still, decisions to be made. So just keep that in mind that I am talking in the context of digital SLR, but the concepts will apply across the board in terms of these general decisions. So the first thing, I think, is to think about what is your inventory? Which lenses do you have at your disposal? What options are available to you as you're deciding? In other words, before you decide which lenses you're going to put into your camera bag, you need to know which lenses you actually have available. And so kind of doing a little bit of an inventory, I imagine that most of you are familiar with which lenses you already have, but if you're like me, every now and then you dig to the back of your camera closet and find a lens you haven't thought about in a long time, a lens that has been sitting back there gathering dust, and you say, oh, I could put this to use for some special project or what have you. But as you're doing that inventory, remember, you can always buy or rent more. And one of the things that I think is a great approach, and I'm so happy to see that these services are now available, is the ability to rent lenses. And there's a couple of reasons that you might do this and that I would encourage you to think about it. Number one, renting lenses or other gear, camera gear, whatever the case might be, because you can rent a wide variety of camera gear and accessories. First and foremost, that gives you the opportunity to try before you buy, to test out a lens and see, does it really suit your needs? Are you really comfortable using it? Is it too heavy for you? Does it not give you the field of view that you thought you were going to get? And so trying out a lens, testing something out before you make a decision to purchase it, but also just supplementing your gear, getting a lens that you don't think you're going to use all that often and maybe is a little bit expensive, and instead renting it for the short period of time. And I've done this on a variety of occasions. I'm working on a special project. I could really use a particular lens, but I don't want to buy it. I don't really feel that I'm going to need to use it very often, so I'd rather just borrow it. And so there are a variety of options out there. One of the services I've used is lens rentals. Another is borrow lenses. And so if you check those out, I think you'll find that they offer a really good service. They'll ship the lens right to you with a mailing label, a shipping label, so you can send it back at the end of your rental period. You can insure the lens, which I always recommend doing, so that you just don't have to worry. You can go out, put that lens to use, and then send it back when you're finished with no concerns at all, thanks to that insurance, and more importantly, being able to test out some gear that you might not otherwise actually purchase. So, of course, I'm talking about which gear you're going to take along on a trip, which means that one of the things we need to consider is where are you going? And so here's a map. This is a map from my Lightroom catalog. And so you can see that my camera has been to a lot of places. And one of the things I've learned along the way in my travels is that while there's a lot of similarity, the photo opportunities really are different, are unique in some form everywhere you go. And so no matter where you're going, you really want to give some thought to where it's going to be, what it's going to be like, what are the conditions going to be like, certainly what the weather is going to be like. So consider where you're going for your photography. And, this might start with a decision about where, meaning you're going to a particular place for vacation. You're going to a Caribbean island to relax for the weekend or for a week, and you want to bring your camera along so you can capture some photos along the way. Or your decision-making, your thought process might start with the what. In other words, what sort of subject matter. If you want to photograph birds, you might go to Florida, or if it's going to be wildlife, you might go off to Africa or to Yellowstone. And so figuring out where you want to go based on the subject matter. And the bottom line, of course, being that before you're making your decision about which lenses you're going to take with you, you kind of need to know where you're going, because that's going to impact a variety of factors in that decision-making process. And sort of related to that is, in addition to where you're going, thinking about how long you're going to be there. And so for me, living in New York City, if I want to go photograph the Brooklyn Bridge just after sunset, then I know I only need to be gone for a few hours. And, it's an interesting consideration here, because there's sort of two angles, you might say, to this. If it's a short trip, just a few hour outing, for example, then there's going to be less variety. If it's a shorter amount of time, by definition, I'm not spending as much time photographing. By definition, I'm not covering as much ground, probably. And so I'm not going to see as much variety in terms of different subject matter. Going to Brooklyn Bridge Park and photographing Lower Manhattan, I basically am going to be seeing city skylines and maybe some people nearby. So I know what the subject matter is going to be. And with fewer opportunities, meaning fewer photographic subjects in general, that probably also means that I don't need as much in the way of gear. I don't need as many different lenses available to me. I could probably settle on one or two lenses. The flip side of that is that if it's a short outing, you might be willing to carry more gear. You might say, well, it's only a few hours. I can manage a really heavy backpack for a short period of time. Or I'll take my roller bag with me so I don't even have to worry about it. I can take as much gear as I want because, hey, it's not a very long trip after all. And then, if it's not a short trip, maybe it's going to be a longer trip. Maybe you're going to Europe, for example, and you're going to visit Rome in Italy, and you're going to visit Austria, and maybe you're going to visit London as well. You're going to a variety of different areas, different countries in this case, different cities, whatever the case might be. Well, with a longer trip, naturally, you're going to have a wider variety of opportunities, at least in theory. But at the same time, with a really long trip, you might not have as much of an appetite for carrying lots of gear. I kind of feel like oftentimes the longer the trip, the more I'm trying to cut back on what I'm bringing, because already I need to bring so much more. I need more clothes for a long trip, and I need more gear for the variety of subjects, and I need more this, that, and the other. And so it's sort of an interesting balance. We might have more opportunities on a longer trip, but we might not want to carry as much stuff because we're already bringing a lot with us. More on that in just a moment, but another consideration in terms of the trip and kind of the nature of that trip is, will that trip be exclusively for photography? Are you going on a photographic adventure, or are you going on a vacation? You're going to go have some fun and relaxation, and you'll squeeze in a little bit of photography along the way. And I've had a variety of trips. It's sort of funny. The very first time that I visited Florence in Italy, I didn't have a proper camera. I brought a point-and-shoot camera because to me, it was just a vacation. I wasn't there for photography. I admittedly did regret that decision just a little bit because then I saw how beautiful Florence was and how many great photographic opportunities there were. But the point is that sometimes you're not going to be as focused on photography during some trips as you would on others. And of course, there's also trips that I take where the only thing I'm doing really is photographing, capturing photos. I'm up for sunrise, I'm out till after sunset, maybe I can get a break somewhere in between, but there's nothing else going on. I'm just capturing images. And so that is sort of going to adjust the balance. Not only just do I need more gear, after all, there's no sense bringing lots of lenses if you're not going to spend very much time actually taking pictures. But then, of course, if you're focused exclusively on photography, you might, forget about bringing another pair of shoes. I'm going to pack a couple extra lenses. So you'll make different decisions about prioritizing your packing, not just in terms of decisions about which lenses or how many lenses, but how you're balancing those overall decisions when you try and decide, okay, my bags are only so big and I can only manage so much weight. So how am I balancing those different decisions about what I'm packing, what I'm bringing? And then along the way, of course, when you're traveling, and again, this depends on the nature of the trip and how long it is and the purpose of the trip, how much photography you're going to do, but you really do need to think about the transportation and not just how am I getting there, but how am I traveling once I'm there? So, for example, are you going to fly to Tokyo and then that's an airline trip, obviously, then take the bullet train to another city, maybe to Kyoto? Or are you just flying to London and spending time there? Or are you flying to Europe and then taking a road trip through Slovenia and Austria in the winter time? And so thinking about the nature not just of getting there in the first place, but how will you be maneuvering? How will you be traveling once you're there? So maybe you're flying somewhere, then taking a road trip, but along the way, you might even go hiking up into the mountains. And so that will impact some of your decisions about the lenses you might bring. Obviously, it affects also, what sort of camera bag or backpack are you bringing? What sorts of accessories might you bring? Are you bringing a tripod? Are you bringing a tripod at all? And are you going to use it? But again, for our purposes today, what lenses are you going to bring, and how will those different modes of transportation affect your decisions? And I can give you an example from a recent trip. No, I was not fortunate enough to travel on a C-17, but are there any weight restrictions? If you've got yourself a chartered C-17, then you can bring all sorts of gear and trucks and basically anything. But obviously, in the real world, we're going to have some more limitations. In fact, I'm sure some of you are familiar, maybe you've had trips going on safari where you almost feel like you need to make a choice between, are you bringing a toothbrush or are you going to bring that filter that you'd like to put to use? So you really have to be very careful about weight limitations, especially when you have, for example, a commuter flight or a chartered flight, maybe a chartered flight on a small aircraft. Could be a single engine plane where you're very restricted in terms of how much weight in gear you can bring with you. And in fact, I had an experience on a recent trip returning from Europe, and I'm sure you've heard about airlines limiting the weight. Of course, your checked bags, you're limited in weight. You can always pay for an extra bag. You can pay for a bag that's too heavy. But we never used to have to worry about carry-on bags, and this is a particular issue for photographers. Because as photographers, we've often got a lot of gear. That gear can be a little bit heavy. Lenses, they've got a lot of glass. That glass can get very, very heavy. And on top of that, we are also very often concerned about the safety of that gear, if you will. In other words, we'd rather carry on our camera gear rather than put it in our checked luggage, both out of fear of luggage getting lost or stolen or, of course, getting damaged along the way. And so I try, for example, to make sure that my camera, my lenses, my hard drives, my laptop, the things that I care about most, the most important things to me, those come with me in my carry-on bag. And then I'll even put, for example, a tripod into a checked bag. In many cases, I can take off the ball head and get a tripod comfortably into a checked piece of luggage. But on a return flight, I had an airline who actually did weigh carry-on bags. And they were limited to 10 kilograms, about 22 pounds, if you were in a basic fare. And that went up to, I think it was 33 pounds if you had an upgraded fare, such as first class. And so that can be a very real limitation. If you kind of start doing the math about a variety of different lenses, it doesn't take much to get to that sort of limit. And so as airlines are increasingly putting restrictions on weight, on our baggage in general, not just for checked luggage, but also for carry-on bags, this becomes a very real concern. And beyond that, of course, maybe you've got that big cargo jet that you're going to fly halfway around the world and you can bring as much stuff as you want. But once you get there, now you've actually got to carry that gear, probably carrying it on your back if you're using a backpack or a more traditional camera bag, for example. Or maybe I've seen many photographers now increasingly using roller bags, which certainly helps. But you've still got a potentially heavy bag that you've got to roll around town or whatever the case might be. So you need to give that some thought, both in terms of restrictions that are going to be placed on you by others, as well as restrictions that you simply want to place on yourself so that you can actually manage the gear you're going to be bringing with you. And then as you're getting closer and closer, kind of planning out this trip, the next thing that I tend to think about is what sort of photo opportunities can you expect? Now, sometimes it's difficult to anticipate. So, for example, if you're going to Africa for a safari, you know that you're going to see, or hopefully you're going to see lots of wildlife, but you might not anticipate the variety of birds that you might see, or opportunities to visit a village somewhere and photograph the people. And so sometimes it can be a challenge, certainly. But to the best of your ability, try to consider what sort of photographic opportunities are going to be out there. What can you anticipate photographing? Sometimes it's relatively easy. So here, for example, in Rome, if you're just going to go to Rome for a week and spend some time exploring the city and photographing some of the highlights and hidden corners, it's relatively straightforward, right? You're primarily photographing architecture. Maybe you'll do some people photography along the way. Similarly, if you were to come join me in New York City, we would explore around and photograph primarily architecture and street scenes and people. And so depending on where you're going, other trips, if you go to Yellowstone, it's going to be wildlife and the landscape. And so it all depends on where you're going. But as much as you can, try to anticipate what sorts of subjects, because naturally those subjects are going to help dictate what lenses you're going to need, the specific photographic opportunities. So if it's a bird, you could theoretically photograph a bald eagle with a 16 millimeter lens. But you're going to have to get pretty close to that eagle, and that's sometimes easier said than done. And so sometimes, it's a wild animal that you cannot approach very closely, or it's just not safe to approach closely. In other cases, you can approach. So if you're wandering around a city, you have a greater flexibility in terms of getting close to a scene versus stepping back a little bit as needed. So you very often can fine-tune your position to accommodate the focal length lenses that you have available. But of course, in some cases, you're just simply going to be limited. But the more you can think about all the possible photos you think you might capture, the better off you're going to be as you're making those decisions, because you'll be making a more informed decision about the particular lenses that will make sense on a trip. And then, especially if you've been photographing for a while, and if you've been shooting digitally for a while, which fortunately I have, you might have a mountain of data that you could dig through. And so I find it very helpful to consider, what focal lengths do you use most? Now, this depends a little bit on context, so you might look at your entire library of photos and just see which lenses you use the most. But it's better if you're narrowing this down to what makes sense. So, for example, if I were going out on a trip where I am intending to photograph birds, I don't want to go through my photos of New York City, as is the case here, because in New York City I'm not generally photographing birds. And I'm not generally going to be carrying around a 500 or 600 millimeter lens with which to photograph birds. And so I would be looking at a lot of more kind of wide angle lenses, or kind of a normal shorter focal length range. And so you want to make sure that you're evaluating images. So here, for example, if you're planning a trip to New York City, but it's not your first time in New York City, you could look at your previous trips and consider which lenses did you use during that trip. And it's not simply a statistical thing. In other words, it's not only about what did I use because that's what I'm going to use again, but what did I use and how did I feel about those results? Did I feel that I was missing out on anything? And so, just as a simple example here, I'm looking at, in my Lightroom catalog, a handful of outings in New York. Now, I live in New York City, but I travel so extensively that I actually don't spend a tremendous amount of time photographing here. But I pulled together some outings, some trips essentially, folders here, that represent a handful of recent years of photographic outings. And then I filtered those images to only those that got tagged essentially as favorites. In my workflow, that means an image that got a 1-star or greater rating. So these are just the selects from a handful of recent photo outings in New York City. And then, using the filters, in this case, again, I'm using Lightroom to manage my photos, and so I can actually take a look at the filters. I've already filtered based on star rating. I had selected some folders, and I'm looking at all of the contents of those folders based on images that have star ratings, and I can look at the metadata at the filtering option, and it shows me the lenses that were used for the photos that are currently being displayed, along with a number indicating how many photos I actually captured with each of those lenses. So let's take a closer look at that. You can see here, among those favorite photos from a recent group of photo outings in New York City, I used a grand total of 9 lenses. The total number of photos for all lenses, in other words, you can see the top number there at the top right, is 355. And then if we take a look at the different lenses, so there's some really wide angle. The 10 to 24, for example, that is specifically for cropped sensor. So that's effectively a 16 millimeter to about a 38 millimeter, give or take, effective focal length if we compare that to full frame. So just to be clear about some of those very short focal lengths. And then we've got some longer lenses. So at the bottom of the list, a 150 to 600 millimeter lens. Wow, a big lens with a tremendous range. When are you ever really going to use such a long lens in New York City? And the answer is not very often. You can see that there's only 2 photos that I captured with that lens in New York City. And so evaluating the various numbers, you can see that the vast majority of the photos were captured in what I would think of as sort of an intermediate or a mid-range lens focal length. A handful of wide angle, but you could make a distinction here about which sorts of focal lengths I'm most likely to use in New York City, again, assuming that I don't have any regrets about missing opportunities. You can see there is a 70 to 200 millimeter lens there, 47 images, but keep in mind also that if I'm using that as a decision maker about that lens, I also want to take a look at which specific focal lengths did I use. In other words, was I using the 70 to 200 mostly in the 70 millimeter range, 70, 80, 90 millimeter focal lengths? or was I mostly using it up at the 200 millimeter range, at the longer range? So that makes a big distinction, because if it's mostly using the 70 to 200 but right around 70 millimeters, then I might as well stick with a 24 to 70 or a 24 to 105. I don't need to necessarily bring that lens. And so looking at the basic data, but drilling in a little bit deeper, especially as you're making more nuanced decisions. And, here obviously the lenses make sense. New York City, mostly street photography or architectural photography or what have you, cityscapes and all that fun stuff. And so it makes sense. Of course, if you're walking around a city, you're able to walk right up to the subjects you're going to photograph, so you don't need a super long lens. So here, obviously, it's pretty logical, but I think this is still a really good exercise to go through to evaluate when you're in a particular type of location, how much do you tend to use one range of focal lengths versus another, super wide angle versus super telephoto versus those mid-ranges in between, etc. And along the way, you might find that you have some similar lenses. So it's actually really interesting to me in general. And I do find that a lot of photographers sort of struggle not only with what to put in their bag, but what to buy in the first place. But you might have a variety of lenses that are actually very similar to each other. I've had some lenses, for example, that were very similar, not identical in focal length, a 35 millimeter versus 45 millimeter, for example. They're very, very similar in terms of field of view, so I don't need both probably. Which one should I take? For me personally, and it's easy to tell looking at my library, I tend to go with a lot of wide-angle field of view, and so I would tend to bring the wider shot, the wider lens, rather than the, slightly longer, 35 instead of the 45, for example, based on my experience. But here's another example, a 70 to 200 millimeter lens, and I'm sure many of you have made this decision. It's a very common lens range. The 70 to 200 millimeter range in general is very popular, and very often you'll find that you have a couple of different options. On the left here, the 70 to 200, that's an f2.8. On the right, because I'm comparing two of the same make lenses, it happens to be a 70 to 210, but think of it as just a 70 to 200. That's an f4 though. And over on the left, we have a lens that's a little bit longer, 7.6 inches compared to 6.9 inches. And on the left, a little bit thicker diameter, wider you might say, 3.45 inches versus 2.99 inches. And the lens on the left is a bit heavier, 3.3 pounds compared to 1.9 pounds. And so by and large, it seems that the lens on the right wins, hands down. It's smaller, it's lighter, it even has a tiny bit greater focal length range, going up to 210 millimeters rather than just 200. But there's a reason that that lens is smaller and lighter, and that is that it's an f4 lens, meaning that aperture only opens up to f4 as its maximum aperture size, whereas the version on the left will open up all the way to f2.8. Now, I know for photographers, we often think about aperture as being primarily about depth of field, but keep in mind there's another consideration there, and that is autofocus performance. And so if I'm going out and just intending to photograph in a city, or maybe do some landscape photography where I want to be able to extract out a scene, and I'm not going to photograph any fast action, and I'm not going to be in any particular hurry other than making sure that I'm getting my shots in before the light goes away, then the f4 lens is going to be perfectly fine. The f2.8 lens is going to give me a tremendous advantage potentially when I need to focus that much faster. So birds in flight, for example, or action photography. And so this is the reason that many photographers, including myself, have both of these types of lenses, because when the conditions allow, I'd rather bring the smaller, lighter lens. But if I know I'm going to be photographing faster moving subjects where autofocus performance becomes a little bit more of a challenge, then I want to go with that. I'm willing to carry that extra weight of the lens that's able to focus a little bit faster. And yes, it could potentially give me some narrower depth of field. Not that that's going to be an outrageous difference, f2.8 versus f4, but still a difference. More importantly to me is that autofocus performance, because the f2.8 lens is allowing more light. But that's not to say I always need that f2.8. I can sometimes get away with the f4, depending on the photographic subjects I'm anticipating, and of course then I get some savings in terms of size and weight. The weight is more significant, I would say, than the size, but The weight counts for sure, and the size does make a little bit of a difference as you're trying to cram more gear into your camera bag. And then there's an exercise that I recommend going through to help you make a decision about the gear that you're going to bring. And actually, this is the way I often describe to my workshop participants when they're getting ready to come join me in a particular location and they want to know which lenses they should bring and whether or not they really need a particular lens. Could they get away with leaving one behind? And the way I like to talk about my own decision making in this context is the just one more exercise. And the way this works is I start out with, if I could only bring one lens, which lens would it be? And so let's assume, just for sake of argument, that I'm talking about heading off to Rome in Italy, one of my favorite cities to photograph, and I can only bring one lens with me. Which one is it going to be? Now, obviously, we can consider all of the things that I've already talked about today in terms of anticipating the subject matter and the type of the trip, etc., and also thinking about what do I do historically. And so maybe I had never been to Rome. I've been several times, but let's say I'd never been to Rome. Well, it's somewhat similar to New York City, or somewhat similar to other European cities in terms of the types of subject matter you would probably be photographing. And so for me, that's actually a really classic scenario, very typical, where I call this my standard walkabout lens. I'm going to be mostly walking around, just finding photo opportunities as they arise. And so to me, if I could only bring a single lens, that's going to be something like a 24-70 or a 24-105. And again, just as a reminder, in my particular situation, I'm talking about a digital SLR with a cropped sensor, meaning that those effective focal lengths or the field of view changes as compared to a full frame sensor, for example. But again, just to reiterate that these focal length ranges are based on my own camera setup. But to me, again, this is just a great general walkabout range. I'm able to take advantage of most opportunities. If a beautiful bird flies by, I'm probably not going to get a great photo of it. Or if I have maybe a macro subject, I might not be able to focus quite that close. Or if I have a situation where I'm inside of an interesting building, maybe I'm in the Pantheon and I want a super wide angle shot that incorporates the columns and the ceiling and the hole in the ceiling and the sky above, I might not be able to get that wide a view. So certainly, if I'm only bringing one lens, there might be some compromises, but I'm thinking about only one lens. And fortunately, in most cases, I'm not limited to just one lens. And so then the next question is, what if I could bring just one more? Well, if I could bring one more, again, this is my decision-making process just by way of an illustrative example. You might have a completely different way of approaching this. You might start off with your 600 millimeter lens for bird photography, for example. But for me, in terms of my own photographic tastes and photographic priorities, usually after that standard walkabout lens, the direction I tend to go is wanting a wider view. This is a really interesting place. Here's an interesting perspective. I wish I could get a little wider, but I'm already laying on the ground to get this shot. I can't get any further away from whatever it is that I'm, photographing up toward. And so for me, very often I want a wider field of view, taking me beyond whatever the limitation is of my first lens. So supplementing that 24-70, for example, with, in my case, typically a 10-24. Again, that's a digital lens, so it's the equivalent of something like a 16, well, not something like, in my case, exactly a 16 millimeter effective field of view as compared to a full frame camera setup, full frame digital SLR or 35 millimeter, going out all the way to about a 38 millimeter field of view in terms of that focal length comparison. But again, point being is that for me, after those basic walkabout type of scenarios, my next priority tends to be wide angle. And then going beyond that, if I could bring just one more lens, well, for me, now I start thinking about wanting extra reach. What can I reach out to, so to speak, to get some little detail? So since I'm talking about a hypothetical trip to Rome, some detail of a building or, some little section of the cityscape when viewed from a hilltop above, or whatever the case might be, zeroing in on a person that I'm talking to on the street. And so I'm tending to want to extend my reach a little bit. And for me, that's going to mean, in this case, going to something like a 70 to 200 millimeter lens, so that I can extend that walkabout lens to have a little bit more reach. And then, of course, in some cases, you might find that we're able to take things a step further. I might be able to bring one more lens. And so if I could have one more lens, well, for me personally, I know you might be assuming we need to go longer, we need a longer reach, but remember, I'm also using as my example right now Rome in Italy. And so for me, one of the other things that I tend to look toward and enjoy photographically is very narrow depth of field. And so then I'm going to start thinking about, well, okay, I could get some narrow depth of field with that 70 to 200, especially if I brought the f2.8 version along. But if I want a wider field of view up close, then I might think about something like a 35 millimeter f1.8. So a lens that I can focus close, I can get close to my subject, have a relatively wide field of view, all things considered, and get some very, very narrow depth of field, which I find that I really enjoy photographically. And so that would be kind of my next decision, the next lens I would add to my bag if I could add just one more. And then beyond that, what if I'm really feeling like I'm feeling strong, I'm feeling that I can carry lots of gear on this particular trip? Then what might I do? And obviously that means starting to look probably to a longer focal length. And for me, that has meant a 150 to 600 millimeter lens, in part because I'm not a bird photographer first and foremost, so I don't need a prime 500 or 600 millimeter lens, and I love the flexibility of a zoom lens. And so a 150 to 600 actually supplements my sort of typical gear setup. It matches up pretty nicely with a 70 to 200 as far as extending that reach. There's not a tremendous amount of overlap there. Now again, these decisions are based in large part on my personal preferences as a photographer and also the type of trip that it's going to be. So in Rome, I don't think I really need the 150 to 600. If I had it with me anyway on a trip, sure, I might find a way to put it to use. But in this case, I probably don't need that 150 to 600. But this is also based on what gear do I actually have? What's in my closet? Or what can I actually rent, or what am I thinking about renting to take on the trip? But again, a lot of this starts with what have I got, and among those things, among those lenses, which will I bring with me? But then this leads to kind of the obvious question of where do you draw the line? And in this case, I guess you could literally draw a line somewhere on the screen here, because I started with the lens that if I could only bring one, that's the lens on the far left, and I worked my way from left to right. So I could kind of draw the line somewhere in here. Where am I going to cut off? Where am I going to say, nah, I don't need those other lenses? For a trip to Rome, more than likely I would just leave the 150 to 600 behind. That's not to say for every trip I'm going to take 4 lenses with me, but again, that would be sort of the workflow, my process for thinking about which of these lenses I might want to bring. And the answer is going to be different. I'll share some specific kind of conceptual examples, and I know I've got some questions already coming up about particular scenarios, so we'll address those shortly. But the key is to use this as kind of a thought process to help you prioritize which lenses you're going to take. And I think it's also worth pointing out, maybe taking a minor detour here, to consider that in some cases the lenses we're considering are what I would refer to as specialty lenses. Lenses that have sort of special features. So here on the left, for example, is a 35 millimeter lens. Well, my 24 to 70 millimeter lens covers that range. It covers 35 millimeters, so why do I need a 35 millimeter lens? Well, in this case, it gives me the advantage of narrow depth of field. It's an f1.8 lens, and so that gives me kind of this specialty feature, you might say. Or the 150 to 600 on the right, that gives me this tremendous range. Not only long focal length, which is great by itself, but this ability to shift back and forth between really long and sort of these intermediate focal lengths. But that to me is sort of a specialty purpose. For typical landscape photography or travel photography, I probably don't need that lens, but I might appreciate having that lens. Which leads to another thing that I encourage you to think about as you're deciding which lenses to bring with you is what might you regret? Might you get out on a trip and think to yourself, boy, I sure wish I had such and such a lens. So let's use the 150 to 600 millimeter lens as an example, because this is a great range. It covers a tremendous range of focal lengths. It's also pretty big, so it's going to take up a lot of room in my camera bag, and it's a bit heavy at 4.4 pounds. So that isn't necessarily something I want to carry with me on a backpacking trip, for example, if I'm not sure how much I'm going to use it. But am I going to regret not having it? So, for example, I had a trip, it was just under 6 weeks long, and during the trip I captured 6,331 photos to be exact, and some of those photos were captured with this lens, the 150 to 600. But among my favorites, when I took a look at the images that I really liked, those with a star rating, those that I was, you might say, happy that I had, among those there were only 3 that were captured with this lens. So out of 6,300 plus images, obviously narrowing that down to just my favorites, but among my favorites, only 3 involved this lens. And yet, I'm very happy that I have the photos that I captured with this lens on that trip, because they're photos that I like. So I've got a nice sunset, and I've got a bald eagle, and I've got some mountains, and these are all essentially extractions. The mountains there and the sunset, those were both captured at the full 600 millimeter focal length of this lens. The bald eagle, as it turns out, was captured at a focal length of 329 millimeters, but all of those photos were not possible with the other lenses that I had in my bag. And so I think, considering, am I happy that I carried this lens with me on an extended trip when, you might say, I suppose a little cynically, all I got was these 3 photos? Yeah, I'm okay with that because I really like these photos. And so I don't mind having carried that lens. And of course, there were potentially other opportunities I might have had. And I don't necessarily, on a 6-week trip, I wasn't backpacking for 6 weeks, so I didn't have to carry this lens on my back the whole time. So you'll want to take that obviously into consideration as well. And then a question. Some of you, I know, I've seen a couple of questions popping up that are kind of related to this, whether another, you might say, specialty lens might make sense, might possibly suit your needs. Will an all-in-one lens be a good fit for your particular needs? This happens to be an 18 to 400 millimeter lens, so that covers a tremendous range, wide angle all the way to telephoto. Well, that also raises a good question, and so I actually want to put up a poll on the screen here and ask you a question. And the question is how willing you would be to take just one single lens on a trip, considering that it could be an all-in-one like this. So I'm going to launch that poll, and so if you would please answer the question, is it, no problem, you often travel with just one lens? Or maybe, but you'd be a little bit apprehensive, a little bit nervous about it? Or is the answer, not a chance? You absolutely need to have a variety of lenses available to you on a given trip. And so I'm going to leave that poll up for just a moment. And let's take a look at a couple of these questions here and see. Yes, so here David's asking about an 18 to 250, so actually a pretty similar lens to what I was talking about here, and that he finds it to be a good general purpose lens. Is there a better general purpose lens? Well, I guess he's talking about an 18 to 250 in particular, which is a good lens. I would say that extra reach does come in handy, and so for me, if I'm going to be traveling with just one lens, I want to have a pretty good range. Now, you need to consider sharpness, and I'll talk more about those issues in just a moment, but it's a great point. My key thing is I do find personally that I like having that additional range. Norman asked a really good question also that I haven't addressed thus far is, as a general rule, zoom lenses versus prime lenses. And this is something that's changed a little bit in terms of quality, and so I would say that for in the old days, let's say, there was an absolute clear advantage to a prime lens in terms of image sharpness. and then you would compromise on that prime lens when you needed more flexibility, or you didn't want to be so limited. And so there was a more easy trade-off, you might say. Now, many of these zoom lenses have gotten to be remarkably sharp, often mostly through the entire range, where you're not really compromising all that much. And so I would say that it's, prime is much less important than it used to be. So unless it gives you some other advantage, I would tend to be more, I personally prefer zoom lenses because I like the flexibility, but I do want to check sharpness. I don't want a zoom lens for the sake of having a zoom lens and then it's not a sharp lens. So checking the overall results in terms of what sharpness you can expect. But it's not as clear a cut as it used to be in terms of prime is going to absolutely give you a sharper result. All right, so I'm going to close the poll now. And very, very interesting. So we have only 21% said no problem at all. And in fairness, I suspect some of those 21% are photographers who are already using maybe a mirrorless system and they've got an all-in-one kind of a lens that works well for their needs. It's got a really good range. I've had some photographers on my workshops who literally never changed lenses the entire time because they had one of these lenses with a tremendous range. And I can assure you that some of us, myself included, were at times envious of that capability. And about 28% said not a chance, that they need to have a variety of lenses available to them. I certainly understand that because I, more often than not, do have multiple lenses with me. And then just over half, 51%, said maybe, but they'd be a little bit apprehensive. And so actually, I can tell you briefly, I had exactly that experience. I was going to be traveling for an extended period of time, for about 3 months actually, of ongoing travel, and I wanted to travel light. And so I'll be talking more about this in a future presentation, this particular trip that was kind of an extreme example, but I took only the 18 to 400 millimeter lens. Now, in fairness, when I told people I was taking just one lens on a trip, they thought, wow, that's impressive. Except it's not like it was, I'm just bringing a 50 millimeter lens on a trip. I'm still going to have a lot of flexibility, but it's only one lens all the same. And so in this case, the image on the left, the wide angle view, that was at a focal length of 53 millimeters. The tight shot close up, zeroing in on the rainbow effect near the base of the waterfall, that's at a focal length of 355 millimeters. So tremendous range in a lightweight package. It's not going to be as sharp as if I had been using, a prime 50 millimeter lens and a prime 300 millimeter lens. And if I had a narrower range of focal lengths, a 70 to 200 is probably going to give me greater sharpness than a lens that has this longer range. So there's certainly going to be some compromises, but is it possible that those compromises are worthwhile for a particular scenario where you need to travel light or whatever the case might be? And so this actually ended up working out perfectly great for me on this trip, and I'll talk more about that again in a future presentation. But bear in mind that these options do exist, and they're continuing to get better and better with stabilization or vibration reduction, vibration control, and so all these different features, good autofocus performance. So they're generally not going to open up to as wide an aperture compared to lenses with less of a range. So there's a big balancing act here in terms of the decision-making process, but it is something that might work at least for certain trips, for certain photographers. And so I certainly understand those of you who are a bit apprehensive. I was a little apprehensive as well. Even though this lens has a tremendous range of 18 to 400, I was still a little worried that I might miss out on some opportunities, but fortunately that didn't turn out to be a significant issue. And don't forget, there's also a notion of less is more. And so, one of the classic exercises in photography is to place sort of artificial restrictions on yourself. You can, go out into a field and you can't move more than 10 foot from a spot, or you can't leave your backyard, or you can only use a 50 millimeter lens, or in this case, a 35 millimeter lens. You're going to be more limited in that type of situation, but you're also going to work a little harder, and that actually might lead you to get better photos as a result. I haven't been brave enough to go out with just a 35 millimeter lens on a trip that's multiple weeks or months long, but I've certainly restricted myself in that way for shorter photo outings. And so sometimes just having maybe a single prime lens or a narrow range zoom lens, and that being your only lens, knowing that you're going to miss out on certain opportunities, but it might actually make you work a little harder as a photographer, and you may be happier with your photos as a result. So before we wrap up, I do want to address some questions, of course, but I wanted to bring up a few sort of sample camera bags just to kind of help you a little further on with this thought process. And so, depending on which bag you're bringing, this is not the only bag that I would tend to use. This is a bag that I use. It's a Pro Tactic bag from Low Pro, and it's rather small. It's not perfect. It's not ideal for some circumstances. There's some compromises, but it is thin. It does enable you to have a laptop in there. Usually I carry a little bit bigger backpack. But the point is, once you've decided on what you're bringing, you're going to have a bag. What are you putting in the bag? And that depends on the trip. So for me, a very typical combination is a 24 to 70 is my first choice, and then that 10 to 24 I mentioned along with the 70 to 200. So I've got coverage, again, translating depending on what camera system you're using, but I've got a coverage in terms of the actual focal length of the lenses of 10 millimeter all the way up to 200 millimeter. For me, that works for many of my typical trips. This is probably all that I need. And then for something like a road trip, where I know that I can basically bring anything and everything. It might be a little more challenging if I'm flying somewhere to get there for the road trip, but once I'm there, I can just keep everything in the trunk of the car, and so I'm not quite as concerned about weight. And then I'm going to bring not necessarily everything that I own, but everything that I generally use in terms of kind of my typical range of focal lengths and lenses, including specialty lenses. And then, as I mentioned, sometimes it's traveling extremely light, and so I might opt for an all-in-one, meaning I might go for something like this, a 18 to 400, where I'm missing out on that 400 to 600 millimeter range, and I'm not getting all the way down to that 10 millimeter range, but I'm covering the vast majority of the focal length range that I typically use photographically, and I'm getting the benefit of traveling light. But really, it's just about weighing out these different decisions, which are admittedly, obviously going to be different from one photographer to the next, but they're also going to be different from one trip to the next. So I encourage you to think about some of these examples that I've given you so that you can think about what's going to be your solution, which of course means question mark. We don't know, because there isn't a single right answer. You may differ very significantly in terms of your photographic tendencies compared to mine. And so you might make very different decisions. You might prioritize different lenses. But if you go through that same process, I think you'll find that it's easier to figure out what exactly should you bring. What's going to be the right balance for your needs, for your preferences, for your specific trip, and hopefully with no regrets. Hopefully you're going to have a really good experience, get great photos, and not say, oh, I wish I had brought that one other lens. So just to summarize those overall steps that I've talked about today, number one is taking inventory. So what do you have available, or what could be available if you're going to, for example, take a trip that where you can rent some additional gear, then that is going to expand your inventory essentially. Decide on a travel style. So obviously, where are you going and what kind of trip and how are you going to get around once you're there? And think about the potential subjects along the way that you might photograph, that you might have the opportunity to photograph, or that you hope to have the opportunity to photograph. Review your past trips, see what your tendency has been as a photographer in terms of the focal lengths that you use. And I think especially valuable is going through that just one more exercise. If you could only bring one lens, which would it be? And if you could bring one more lens, what would it be? And so on until your camera bag essentially is completely full. And then think about any specialty options, sort of lenses that you might not necessarily use on a regular basis, but that you might put to use on this particular trip. So I gave the example of the narrow depth of field or a very long focal length, etc. And then anticipate any regrets. How likely am I going to feel like, boy, I should have just suffered through the extra weight and brought that extra lens with me? So think about how you might regret not having access to a particular lens. All right, so let's address some questions. First, I'll mention, by the way, that yes, of course, the recording is available, and the recording of the webinar does go into a course we have that's included in the GreyLearning library. It's in the GreyLearning Ultimate Bundle. And so if you've enjoyed the presentation today and you'd like to learn more from me about how to optimize your photography and your workflow, then you can get all of the content that we publish in the GreyLearning library at $50 off. Here's a link here, timgray.me/GreyBundle99. It'll get you $99 per year for what's already more than 100 hours of content with more coming soon. All right, so let's take a look at some questions here. Great question from Kathleen. What is your opinion on teleconverters? I tend not to use teleconverters very often, but that's primarily because I don't want that extra effort of having to add or subtract. And so, for example, with the 150 to 600, I'm not going to add a teleconverter. So that said, if you didn't have that lens, you had a 500 millimeter lens, then you might add a teleconverter. So you're losing light with a teleconverter, 1 to 2 stops typically, depending on the particular multiplication factor of the converter you're looking for, 1.4 versus 2x, for example. You'll lose a little bit of sharpness, but that's much less of an issue than it used to be. So to me, the key thing is I would be more inclined to use a teleconverter, or teleextender as they're often referred to, if I think it's going to be on the camera basically all the time, because I do find it to be an extra bit of hassle swapping back and forth between the two. So I think, especially nowadays, they've gotten to be excellent, but I do have a little bit of concern in terms of kind of workflow in the field. But obviously, a teleconverter plus a shorter focal length lens is a lot lighter than adding a big extra heavy lens. So certainly there's that to consider as well. And so a similar question from Dick about using a 1.4, using that on great question actually, 1.4 teleextender in Africa on a 2.8 80 to 300 or a 600 prime f4. That's tricky because obviously even with the 1.4, the 300 isn't going to get to the same range. And so, we're getting close, but not quite. And boy, that reach can sure be helpful on an African safari. So I'd kind of want to have both, or I would actually consider in that case using a 2x teleconverter if it's compatible with that particular lens. I'm not sure which one that actually is. So Howard asks what kind of bag you use for around your local area. I almost exclusively use a backpack, even though I very often don't use both straps of the backpack. I do tend to use a backpack for most of my adventures. And so my bag is typically quite heavy when I'm getting somewhere. So on the flight there, for example. And then once I'm there, I can often unload. So unload my laptop and my hard drives, and there might be a lens I'm not taking on a given day. And so that varies a little bit depending on the trip. On rare occasions, I might have, one bag that I travel with and then a different bag that I use for my field photography when I'm out walking about, for example. So I think I mentioned this before, but Tina was asking about the crop factor. And so I'm using a camera that has a smaller sensor, so it's a 1.6x cropping factor. So essentially in terms of field of view, if I use a 100 millimeter lens, it is the equivalent field of view that on a full frame camera, full frame digital SLR 35 millimeter would give you 160 millimeter focal length equivalent field of view. And the main issue there was really early on that I wanted GPS. And so the camera I'm using had a GPS receiver before some of the later models added that feature. So that was one of the most important. Plus, I do tend to like having longer reach, getting narrower field of view. And so I like the cropping factor from that perspective, especially now that we thankfully have some lenses that are specially designed to compensate for that so that I can still get that equivalent field of view of a 16 millimeter lens. And then another question about specialty lenses. Do I use LensBaby or fisheye? I really don't tend to use those very often. You might have noticed in the photo of inventory that I talked about adding up which lenses do you have. There was actually a LensBaby on the table. I do have a couple of LensBaby lenses. I just don't tend to use them all that often. To be honest, I find that they can be a little bit tricky to use to try and get everything exactly the way you want it. And in some cases, a lot of the more basic effects that they offer, you can actually get with post-processing, kind of blurring out to the edges of the image and those sorts of things. So I enjoy them. I think they're great. I don't tend to use them all that often. Fisheye, similarly, fun to play with, but I don't use fisheye really all that very often. As much as I do enjoy going wide angle, I don't find that I go for that kind of distorted look very often. Every now and then, any lens is fun to play with from time to time, but that's not one that I personally tend to use. But I also, don't tend to use extremely long lenses all that super often. And then, great question, boy. And this is a kind of a big one. And this could be, in fact, maybe this needs to be a whole webinar all unto itself. But what kind of bag do you recommend for commercial air travel, with wheels or not? And so it's twofold. One is, if you're going to check baggage, then you absolutely want to use check baggage, meaning with camera gear inside of that bag, that you absolutely want to make sure that you've got a nice solid bag. So I know for many photographers, Pelican cases have been the gold standard for a long time. Now there's a wide variety of other options as well that are ruggedized, that lock, that are padded, that have the padding inside that you can kind of rearrange so that you can fit your specific lenses, and that have nice roller wheels with good quality. So if you've got to check a bag, I would go that route. My approach, I travel, well, it's interesting. I don't fly a ton, but I travel a ton. I usually am on more extended trips, but I try to carry on, and to the extent possible, I try to make sure that, worst case, I could fit a bag underneath the seat in front of me. Sometimes that's just impossible, so I try to make sure I can do whatever I can to board early. But then I'm using a backpack just because it's easier to get around for me personally. I know many photographers like roller bags to get around. The challenge with a roller bag for carry-on is that once I'm where I'm going, I personally want to have a backpack. And so it creates this issue where you're using a roller bag for the first part of your journey. Now you want to switch to a backpack. Well, how do you pack a backpack that's suitable for camera gear? If it's suitable for camera gear, it probably doesn't collapse down very well and pack well. So for me, I usually kind of compromise on that. In the airport, I always wish I had a roller bag. Once I get there, I'm glad that I have a backpack. All right, let's see if we can get a couple additional questions. Oh, Douglas actually asked, I mentioned teleextenders. We'll address the question about teleextenders before, but extension tubes he asked about, and that would be primarily for, well, you might need an extension tube if you're doubling up your teleconverters, but also an extension tube enables you to focus closer. So it's often referred to as a cheap variation, a cheap way to get a macro lens. You can make any lens focus closer by adding an extension tube. And that is, I think, definitely helpful if you tend to want to focus close. So taking a look at what the closest focus range is for your various lenses, an extension tube, it's lightweight, it's small, and it slips into your bag easily. So it can be a great addition if you tend to want to focus fairly close. And let's just one more. I'll try to get to as many of these other questions as follow-ups, maybe in the Ask Tim Gray email newsletter or via email. And feel free to follow up with me via email, and I'll address as much of that as I can moving forward. But Brad asks, variation on a theme here, I guess you might say, in terms of lenses, is what filters? And for me, what filters will you attach to those lenses? There are two basic types of filters that I would tend to add. One that I don't use terribly often, but when I do, I'm sure glad to have it, would be a polarizing filter. And the second would be solid neutral density filters so that I can get longer exposures. I don't use graduated split neutral density filters because they're graduated. They don't match the shape of whatever it is you're photographing. So you'll see things like, the tops of buildings are darker than the bottoms, or the tops of a tree, that sort of thing. And so instead, in situations where I would otherwise use a graduated split neutral density filter, I'll bracket my exposures and create an HDR, or even just a simple composite, but generally an HDR instead. And so the other types of filters I just simply don't use. Generally speaking, solid neutral density on trips where I think I might do long exposure, certainly, and polarizing filters. So on most trips, I will have those types of filters. On the solid neutral density, I'll usually have a couple varieties, maybe somewhere around a 4 to 6 stop and then a 10 stop for those more extreme scenarios. And so I'll bring those on most trips unless I really need to travel light, and then I'll have to think hard about, do I really need to have this particular lens available, or these filters, I should say, available. So as with the decision about lenses in general, hey, if I'm going on a road trip and I'm leaving right from my driveway, then I might just load up everything. If I'm flying there, that's going to affect my decision making. So there's a lot of variables, a lot of different things we need to consider when we're thinking about which lenses that we're going to bring. I hope that today's presentation has helped you with that overall thought process, the decision-making process, so that you can approach it with a little bit more of an organizational approach, you might say, and with greater confidence when you're heading out on a trip that you really do have everything that you need. So thanks again very much for joining me today. I'll look forward to seeing you for a next presentation. In the follow-up email, I will get you the details for the next presentation as part of the GreyLearning webinar series. Thanks again to Tamron for sponsoring the presentation, and I'll look forward to having all of you, I hope, join me for the next presentation as part of the GreyLearning webinar series. Thanks very much, and we'll see you soon.